Good afternoon. My name is Joan Branham, and I'm the acting director of the Women's Studies and Religion program here at Harvard Divinity School. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second in our series of WSRP Works in Progress. I also want to just mention, as you came in on the table, we have our mailing list. So please, if you would like to receive an email to let you know when we have our lectures, do sign that. And as well, there is a lecture poster letting you know when our lectures are. We've already had one lecture. This is our second one. And the next lecture takes place on December 11th across the street at the Center for the Study of World Religions at 5:15. And that lecture will be given by me, yours truly. And I have no idea, what am I speaking on? Oh, yes. Mapping Sacrifice on Bodies and Spaces in Ancient Judaism and Early Christianity. So we'd like to see you there as well. As many of you know, each year 5 full-time research associates are appointed to the Women's Studies program to pursue a topic related to women and religion. And each associate designs and teaches a one-semester course related to a research project and delivers a talk during the year that would deepen our understanding of the topic that is at hand. Today, I'm delighted to introduce to you Professor Sue Houchins, who has joined the Research Associates for the year and holds the position of Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellow in Women's Studies and Religion program. Sue pursued her undergraduate and graduate education in medieval English literature at UCLA, where she began a comparative study of women who write of mystical union with a feminine divine. Sue went on to receive her PhD from the Union Institute and Graduate University in Africana Women's Cultural and Queer Studies, where she concentrated in literatures and religions. Her publications on this subject include the introduction to the volume of Spiritual Narratives from Oxford University Press. Professor Houchins has also recently completed a book-length manuscript on Pan-African lesbian texts, some of which also explore the mystical union I mentioned. And the work we're going to hear today will appear in a larger monograph that will be coming out with Vanderbilt University Press. In 1995, Sue left academia to enter a Carmelite monastery. She rejoined the Academy in the year 2000 as a research associate here in the Women's Studies and Religion program at HDS. She was then invited as the Chancellor's Fellow in the Rhetoric Department at UC Berkeley, and now she is Associate Professor with a joint appointment in African American Studies and Women and Gender Studies at Bates College in Maine. Today, Professor Sue Houchins has entitled her talk, Between Hagiography and Slave Narrative, Teresa Chicaba, an African Nun in 18th Century Spain. Please join me in welcoming Sue Houchins.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be able to join this group of scholars for the year and to have this opportunity to begin a preliminary discussion of Teresa Chicaba. The extraordinary events in her life, in the life of Sor Teresa Juliana de Santo Domingo, who was born in 1676 and who died in 1748, captured the imagination of her official biographer, Father Juan Carlos de Paniagua, a priest who, though not her confessor, had established a friendship with her during the years of her life at La Penitencia, a convent in Salamanca, Spain, a Dominican convent. After Teresa Juliana died, he preached the eulogy at her funeral mass and then published the text under the title the Oración Fúnebre. Then, about 3 years later, he sent to press this full hagiographical account of Sor Teresa's life and virtues entitled The Compendio de la Vida Exemplar de Venerable Madre Sor Teresa Juliano de Santo Domingo, published in Salamanca in 1752. And he called it, he said, From Her Autobiographical Writings and Their Conversations. The two documents, that is the funeral oration and this particular hagiography, are the main sources of information for Sor Teresa, and they provide a wealth of information about her, even as they pose some difficult critical problems. The paper today, which is really about genre, it's a beginning work that I have done with my colleague Balthazar Frabolinero. Balthazar and I have received a contract from Vanderbilt University Press, to do the translation of the hagiography. And one of the things that we found in looking for funds from granting from foundations is that the people who read our applications could not decide what this work was and could not ascribe any kind of historical significance to it. I mean, what do you do with a woman who decides that she is able to return to Africa by moving underneath the water, or who tells all of these stories that seem fantastic? Now, those of us who work in the medieval era and in other eras recognize this and know what to do with it. But we have found over and over again that we have to explain the importance of this document. So this is a paper that I've written to begin to think out how to deal with that issue. So when encountering a copy of the Compendio de la Vida, the spiritual narrative of an 18th century African woman who entered a cloistered Dominican convent in Spain after her manumission, a skeptical 21st century reader might well question the authenticity of this example of life writing. Written by Father Paniagua and published in Salamanca in 1752, the Vida and the funeral oration that preceded it attest to Sor Teresa's extraordinary piety and the charisma that made her an important member of the Catholic community of Salamanca, despite her many years as a slave. The cleric who authored this hagiography, which, like the many biographies of women who led exemplary religious lives, claims to have taken the text from both his numerous collaborative conversations with Sor Teresa during the last months of her life and her writings. If these manuscripts existed, and there is some evidence that they did, then she may be the first African-born woman that I know of to have written in a modern European language. In addition, this oral history of an ex-slave bears a striking resemblance to another genre, the dictated biographies and spiritual narratives of freed African people or ex-slaves in late 18th and 19th century America, those as told to slave narratives, as they're sometimes called. However, for the modern reader accustomed to a different set of evidential norms, these second-hand 18th century texts, replete with their accounts of miracles and visions or stories of clandestine education, gratuitous violence, and fantastic escapes, sometimes strains historical credibility. Yet the genre of women's saints' lives and the body of as told to slave narratives, to which I claim this text equally belongs, have since the 1980s, with the development of feminist and African American historical and literary criticism, become sites recognized for their richness in historical data, for those trained to extract them, and from which to discern the voice of its black female subject. The historical, critical monograph about the Vida that I propose to write will situate Sor Teresa's autobiography at the boundaries of these two problematic genres. Between one, hagiography, which establishes veracity or authority through the third-person mediation of a clerical associate, and the other, an as-told-to slave narrative whose authenticity suffers from the same kind of mediation, that of its white secretary or its writer. Then, having thus defined the form, the hybrid genre of the text, I propose a mode of reading that will detect the saintly subject's textual voice, that subverts her depiction as a docile and or satisfied conforming slave in the Spanish courtly household, and as a compliant donada gift in a Spanish monastery. She's literally a gift offered to the religious community. Further, I intend to show how this text participates in the discursive formation of race, or better yet, of racialized gender, through the contested collaboration or dialogue between subject and writer. And as a product of this discourse, it inserts itself and its subject into the Black Atlantic community. Now, hagiography is commonly defined as a life or legend of a saint. But as André Bauchet suggests, the genre includes accounts of persons regarded as holy or exemplary in their own time, even if they were not formally canonized. Most often, with textual representations of sanctity during the Middle Ages, these writings proliferated after 1540 with the invention of the printing press, which facilitated their dissemination and they were encouraged by the Council of Trent. Hagiographies continued in popularity through the 18th century, when there was a shift in religious life, particularly the vocations of women, from contemplative nuns to active agents of apostolates outside the convent walls. This inspired Catholics to consider different modes of saintly behavior and to transform the writings that recorded and reproduced sanctity. Still, hagiography is one of the most long-lived genres, beginning with Luke's rendering of St. Stephen's martyrdom and having no de facto end. Derived from the conflation of oral and textual sources, hagiographies were often compiled from the spiritual writings of the subject's testimonies, their written and spoken testimonies, and members of their expanded religious community. Biographical data told to a confessor and a spiritual director, or to a priest friend. On occasion, when a religious order believed it had in its midst a particularly exemplary person who might become a candidate for canonization, its members invited a cleric to interview the person during the months closely preceding her death. Such was the case of Dorothea de Mantua, who died in 1394, and it might have well been the case for Sor Teresa as well, since Father Paniagua steadfastly maintained he was neither her confessor nor her director. He was, however, helping a fellow priest, Diego Villarreal, who was the hagiographer of Sor Teresa's confessor, Father Abarotegui. And it's not uncommon to gather material about subjects associated spiritually so as to establish a network of connections that would mutually bolster the causes of the several parties. Since Jacoba's confessor and Father Paniagua belonged to the same religious order, they were Teatines, this might have been another reason for the biographer's interest in her story. Saints are, in the words of Carolyn Walker Bynum, socially constructed, and their legends are fashioned and authenticated in a complex relationship between clerical authorities and the adherents who spread the holy person's reputation for virtues and miracles. Hagiographies, therefore, are profoundly political. Yet this has not disqualified works in this genre as sources for historical research. In fact, historians, anthropologists, and literary critics from the last half of the 20th century until the present have used these saints' tales to examine popular mentalities and to produce demographic data. With the rise of women's studies, researchers began to look seriously at these documents as reflections of women's domestic and urban life. More recently, aware that the protocols of saintly humility dictated that men act as recorders or mediators in the production of spiritual autobiographies, scholars have been concerned whether hagiographical and mystical treatises by and about women might be too opaque, too constructed by high-status male authors to give any window into women's lives. Evidence of true sainthood is derived from the third-person narrative in Exemplary Lives, where the narrator must have been close enough to the subject to vouch for her sanctity, because it is unseemly for a holy woman to boast of spiritual gifts. However, third person was the mark of authenticity for religious readers of saints' lives. But this typical authorial ambiguity, especially in the instance of texts about women's lives written by men, poses evidential difficulty for scholars who seek historical or verifiable certitude. These are not the kind of documents that provide a transparent lens on the historical realities of the experiences of holy women, especially those of holy African women. Yet feminist scholars, not only of the Middle Ages, but also of the modern period, up to and including 18th century, have developed a methodology for reading or finding the aperture in these texts through which to illuminate the past with a fierce and probing light, as well as to raise with nuance and power the fundamental issues of interpretation. Now, spiritual narratives, the other genre, the Protestant first cousin of the Catholic mystical autobiography and its sibling, hagiography, were the genre from which the slave narrative evolved. Black first-person conversion accounts of religious justification and sanctification lay the necessary intellectual groundwork by proving that blacks were as much chosen by God for eternal salvation as were whites. Upon the foundation of this theological argument for racial equality, slave narratives made the case for emancipation, legal, political, economic freedom for Americans of African descent. And we can talk more about those in the question and answer if you'd like. I argue that the Vida of Sor Teresa is both a hagiography and a kind of slave narrative that embeds within its text its own genealogy in spiritual autobiography. This is a story of an African woman who escapes from slavery through the exhibition of her extraordinary holiness, attains a reputation for sanctity and healing, exercises some small power within the religious community that never accepted her in the upper ranks of its social hierarchy. She came to the convent with a small allowance each year, and that allowance was powerful enough that she could spend it for poor women who wanted to enter the convent as choir nuns. And so she paid their dowry. So by the time she left the monastery, or died, she controlled the ruling chapter by virtue of putting them in the convent. She exercised some real power within that religious community. And she manages to have her autobiographical writings and her oral history transcribed, edited, published, and disseminated to the Americas throughout the Black Atlantic as a model of religious perfection for other Africans and people of African descent. The plot trajectory from slavery to freedom meets the expectations of the genre, except that because this narrative is not in the first person, it does not conspicuously assert Teresa's acquisition of literacy. Therefore, not being conventionally autobiographical, the Vida falls within the less respected category for today's readers of as told to slave narratives. And like many of these documents, it raises questions for the modern audience who seeks assurance of the veracity of the text, who infers a contract between the autobiographical subject and reader guaranteeing historical accuracy, realism, and the verisimilitude no life representation can in reality grant in the age of postmodernity. Certainly, a narrative by an emancipated African slave woman in 18th century Spain required, as I said, the mediation of the male authority, as I said, because it was unseemly for her to write. But we have other examples of women with this same difficulty. So remember Rebecca Cox Jackson's spiritual autobiography,
which she said she dictated to her brother. She said, you know, he never got it right. She said he just wouldn't write what I wanted, and so God had to teach me to write so I could do my own. So, by the way, the same complaint that Catherine of Siena makes about the people who write down her autobiography. And so we're going to use a kind of technology at the end of this, or at the rest of this paper, to do a close reading to suggest a way to read through these male voices and this male authority of the text. Sor Teresa de Santo Domingo, who was born Chicaba, was supposedly from the coast of Mina, the part of West Africa that comprises present-day Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. She was enslaved at the age of 9, brought to Spain, and purchased by the Marchioness of Montferrat. She was the wife of the Marquis, who during his tenure as Viceroy to Mexico had been a protector of the writer-intellectual Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. As a member of the retinue of this aristocratic household, Teresa developed an intense spiritual life that in time became her key to freedom. At the death of her owner in 1703, Teresa Chicaba entered a Dominican convent in accordance with the behest of the Marchioness. There, her race and skin color put her at a disadvantage in the highly stratified social order of Spanish monastic houses of the era. And therefore, the community only accepted her as a donada or beata, a servant of the other nuns. Now, present-day readers may well question why an emancipated black woman slave would choose religious life in a monastery. But in Spain and the rest of the Catholic world of Europe and the Americas, female convents were sites of relative spiritual and intellectual freedom and of sexual safety as compared to the alternatives in secular life. In Spanish America, this relative freedom operated both for white and black women, although the case of women of African descent has received much less attention by scholars of Hispano-America. Rosemary Ruther and Joan McNamara, feminist theologians and religious historians of Catholic nuns, cite the autonomous structure of women's monasteries during the Middle Ages, the relatively independent lives of widow and virgin tertiaries and beguines of the early modern era, and evidence from 19th and 20th century white immigrant Catholic women in the United States to support the idea that the convent was a place of emotional solidarity among women and of intellectual opportunity for some. Convents of active nuns became schools and institutes of vocational training for novices who sought to cultivate the life of the mind and to enter a world where reflection was encouraged and valued, even if these women could not afford further education. Although Chicaba lived at an earlier period, she undoubtedly held out hope that liberating opportunities would apply to her. In addition, admission to the Dominican Tertiary Convent of La Penitencia in Salamanca was also an official mark of Chicaba's civil freedom. Though her monastic cell might not have been very different from the quarter she inhabited during her enslavement, and though monastic life limited her mobility, the papers she signed upon entrance with her act of profession documented her newly gained freedom, and the convent was an institution that lived by these papers. Despite her inferior status as a donada, Teresa Chicaba's acts of charity, her mystical experience, and her fame as a healer or miracle worker moved the Dominicans to commission, soon after her death, 2 portraits for the purposes of local veneration. If you go to Salamanca, there is a shrine to her, there are her relics, and she is the reason that convent is still here, that she brings money to that convent as a place of, because this is a place for veneration of La Negrita. At the same time, they initiated the process of beatification, for which Father Paniagua wrote the Vida, which was published in 1752, with a second edition in 1764, a modern edition done in the 90s, so that this book has been before us for quite a while. And throughout this document, he refers to Sor Teresa's autobiographical writings, which he claims to use as primary sources, and from which he purported to quote extensively. These papers are no longer extant in the convent archives to corroborate his assertion, it is possible that while with the Marchioness, Chicaba could have acquired the intellectual preparation that enabled her to read prayers in Spanish, as well as the sacred text and printed sermons, undoubtedly those of her favorite Saint Vincent Ferrer, that were a regular part of women's devotional practice and during the period. Clearly, from Paniagua's narrative, Teresa Chicaba enjoyed special favor with the mistress, who might have tutored her like some European educated women did with their slave companions. Remember, she joins the household as a child, much like Phyllis Wheatley did. And children had a particular purpose. She was the Marchioness's slave. She was not a household slave. And so we think that the Marchioness had something to do with her learning to write. I make this point very strongly because there was a scholar last year at the Du Bois Center who understood Chicaba as a pawn in the Mancera household and who called into question her agency. And for me, it's really important that she had some agency in the producing of this text. So, the Vida depicts her as an African child who is spiritually gifted beyond her years, whose visions augur her espousal to Christ. The text chronicles the celestial visitations that continued until her death, thereby establishing her credentials as a critic. The mystical path was the usual mode Catholic women chose to explain their religious insights, since speculative theology and in the academic world was really out of bounds for them. However, this strategy was fraught with danger, as you might imagine. It put them, especially in Spain, in the eye of the Inquisition. And so, hence, Paniagua and the other writers. There is one other Donada who writes an autobiography later, and she is in Lima. Her name is Ursula de Jesus, and Ursula, in fact, comes before the Inquisition and has to write her way out of it. So we know that there is this theological caution. What I'd like to do is to, in the few minutes, because I want questions, to give you two incidents from the Vida that will give you a sense of Chicaba's agency and how she writes through the text. The first is a depiction of her religious orthodoxy, and it comes as she has an encounter with a fellow slave who is simply identified as the Turkish girl. Allegedly, this follower of Islam became a weapon Satan attempted to wield against the innocent Chicaba. But Teresa's sanctity shielded her from these murderous attacks instigated by the devil. When the assault ceased, Chicaba befriended her assailant, who confided that a Catholic priest had seduced and abandoned her, and she thereby turned against Christianity. She had adamantly refused to convert, despite the efforts of many spiritual and learned men, says the Hagiography. However, Grace chose instead a lowly black slave woman. Teresa, as an instrument of salvation, is what we have here. A reader in 18th century Spain would have marveled at Chicaba's unique sanctity that enabled her to prevail where European men had failed. The power of the incident resides in the stark opposition in categories of difference: race and gender, whiteness versus blackness, men versus women. Undoubtedly, Sor Teresa had some part in this representation of her unusual spiritual and intellectual superiority. Gender and race were inextricably linked in the Vida's depiction of the exemplary virtue of Teresa Chicaba as a candidate for canonization. And in the presentation of Sor Teresa, the rhetoric of sainthood has to construct her as black and woman, a subject that is more than its separate components, and hence this story of the Turkish girl. The story that renders the way that she conquers even after sexual violence has managed to turn the Islamic woman over to Christianity. And in Spain at this time, if you practice Islam, you were not a person really for conversion. You could keep your religion. So this is a very, very particular incident in the text. This is also a period when slavery is not being contested in Spain. And so Paniagua has real difficulty trying to explain what happens to Chicaba and why she would be worthy of sainthood. One of the things he does is he constructs her as the daughter of an African king. And for those of you who know something about slave narratives, this is sort of a standard. She is found with a gold bracelet on. And so he sees that gold bracelet from the Gold Coast as a sign that she is the daughter of royalty. As I look at the text, and with the help of anthropological libraries here and with some oral histories in Ghana, I think she's probably the daughter of a smith, a goldsmith, which is like being the daughter of a priest and who has someone who has powers to do miracles. But he constructs her that way to establish her as a person with purity of blood. If you know anything about Spain, sainthood requires purity of blood. It is, in fact, something that Teresa of Avila is always talking about. She's always talking about her purity, given her converso history. And so this is a way of talking about her purity of blood. He talks also about the vision she sees. She maintains that she discovered Christianity before priests got to Africa. And she says that she had an encounter with a white lady who had a child. And we look at this in the text and understand that it is a white lady that she sees in a fountain, she sees again in the ocean, and that she is probably a water deity that she has conflated with the Blessed Virgin, but it gives her a kind of credibility. Paniagua tells the story of her capture as a slave, and he says that a man dressed as a Spaniard went gently ashore, took her by the hand, and brought her gently on the slave ship. So the story is one of slavery as something that delivers her into Christianity. But there is this break in the story that we believe is a sign of Chicaba's hands. Because after he is told how wonderful it is that she's going to Spain aboard the slave ship, she decides to leap overboard. And the white lady saves her. But the ship is followed by blackbirds and bats all the way to San Tomé, where she is baptized again. She maintains she was baptized by the white lady. And as you look at the narratives, the few narratives we have and the few stories we have of slaves and who are left without water in the hold of the ship, they're always talking about the blackbirds that follow. So we believe that this, what she understands as Satan trying to keep her from being the bride of Christ, is in fact her intervention. But the most important thing, the most striking example of the preservation of her memories is an unusual piece. And I'll end with this. It is a piece of conventual literature, poetry. You know that in many contemplative houses, women are not only encouraged to write their autobiographies, but they're encouraged to write poems. And so there's a poem that Paniagua attributes to Chicaba where Jesus is depicted as a polygamist. The poem in chapter 35 uses the biblical story of the competition between Mary and Martha to criticize the monastic hierarchy among choir nuns, lay sisters, and donadas, with the exception of an autograph letter preserved in the convent of Las Dueñas in Salamanca, and her signature at the bottom of her act of profession, a signature that shows she's used to handling a pen. It's not a shaky signature. There are no other extant documents written by her. In both documents, however, one can observe, as I say, this clear handwriting. We argue that this poem that I'll quote for you is a sign, what Paniagua calls a sign of spiritual jealousy. It captures the attention of any reader as a faithful representation of her voice. It also is in a different dialect than Paniagua's written dialect. You can tell the difference in the dialects in parts of the text from his hand and from hers. So I'll quote in English. "Oh, Jesus, where are you gone? I cannot stand a moment without seeing you. Oh, Jesus of my soul, where are you gone? It seems you are not coming back and you are lost. Oh, Jesus, what shall I say? If you go out with other women, what shall I do? I will wail, I will cry till I see God. And if not, I will die of love. And I say, because I am so lonely that you have not come. And if you are with someone else, I have seen it before. Martha and Mary, you have loved them. Oh, Jesus, where shall I find you? I feel giddy when I have you. Goodbye, goodbye, love, goodbye, Lord, goodbye, heart. No more, no more, no more." Now, as with many hagiographic texts about nuns written by priests, there's always the possibility that the author may have donned the nun's veil in an act of authorial and spiritual transvestism. Close textual analysis, however, indicates that even if Paniagua intervened in this text, in the text of the poem, both content and linguistic peculiarities make it more attributable to Chikaba than to him. She addresses Jesus by both pleading for his attention and accusing him of abandoning her. This piece is remarkable theologically because Chikaba depicts her relation with Jesus as part of a polygamous communion of saints, acknowledging that as a mystical bride, she is not the only one that Christ has espoused. The jealous complaint is unusual because the poetic voice recognizes other women as objects of Jesus' affection. In traditional theology, the mystical marriage of a nun to Jesus is expressed in exclusively monogamous terms. Such is not the case with Chikaba. Certainly, the poem performs a different reading of the scripture. It is striking in its interpretation of Martha and Mary. In conventional church exegesis, Martha and Mary are contrasting examples of contemplation and action in the Christian soul. Sor Teresa combines the traditional representation of both women and implies that they symbolize her case, that she, as a donata, is active but is contemplative in her soul. Christian theology has been at pains to explain away the idea of polygamous Christ and the logical consequence of his mystical marriage to so many nuns. The feeling of jealousy, which Paniagua rationalizes, is a manifestation of Sor Teresa's intense love, might be a reflection of a real circumstances Chikaba experienced in her convent, where she was relegated to manual labor, the work of a donata. In this regard, the recrimination might well be a complaint against some perceived injustice visited upon her by her other sisters. The tension between Martha and Mary in the biblical story might gesture toward this interpretation. In the Lucan Gospel, Martha complains to Jesus for encouraging Mary to sit at his feet, immersed in conversation, instead of insisting both sisters work together to prepare the house for their distinguished visitor. Jesus' response gives authority to Mary's contemplative attitude, the choice to pay rapt attention to the guest. In the light of the spiritual hierarchy, Christ establishes Chikaba demands an explanation from Jesus for placing her at the bottom of the conventual social order. As a donata, her main function in La Penitencia was to work for other nuns. The production of spiritual benefits through her prayers and contemplative life was only secondary. As a black woman with spiritual aspirations, Chikaba must have decided she personified Martha and Mary's drama. She understood that Jesus loved both women through a deft interpretation that started as a jealous complaint and ended as a pious reflection on the role of women. By transforming a biblical passage, she focused on both women protagonists. As a spouse of Christ, she claimed the right to pray and contemplate like the other nuns. As a Christian woman from Africa, she exposes the absurd idea of individual marriage to Christ, and more importantly, she rejects the social division of labor in her convent. She wants a world where all share spiritual communion and physical labor. And as an African princess, that she was, and as a freed slave in Europe, Sor Teresa de Santo Domingo wanted to change the material conditions in which she lived her spiritual life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. That was just wonderful.
Thank you.
I learned so much. We are going to open it up to question and answer, and I've been told that we do need to pass the mic around for it to come out on the film properly. So I would just pass it as the questions come.
Thank you. It was a remarkable presentation about a remarkable woman. I just have a comment about the poem. Being brought up a Catholic, I wouldn't have understood it, but the way that it's written, if you substitute the word Christ for Krishna for Christ, it's very plausible, because I think Hindu women have that relationship with Krishna. It was very, very familiar to me when you were speaking out the poem, but not as a Catholic.
It's very interesting. I've given some version of this paper, and certainly I always read the poem. I love the poem. Anytime you want me to read this poem, I will read this poem for you. And you ought to see me do it with Balthazar, because we do it backward and forward, Spanish and English. But I've read it in three important places. I read it before the Catholic Theological Group, in which the audience was predominantly white, and people sat as silently as you did, because, of course, it does not comply with Catholic theology. When I read it before the Black Catholic Theological Symposium, they hooped, they hollered, they loved it. And I have started calling him a polygamous Jesus. This paper didn't sound like this beforehand, because all those priests and nuns said, oh my goodness, it's the polygamous Jesus. And they talk about him all the time. So it's a really, really important kind of example of reader response theory, that the audience, this black audience, understands the ways in which she is undercutting sort of traditional Catholic theology, that there is a kind of syncretism that takes place here, the ways in which she manipulates money. So there they all are, some of them still in their habits, but they know this woman. She's lived their lives in monasteries here in the United States. And so you're right, there are ways in which it doesn't sound very Catholic at all. But of course, she comes from a situation where her father had more than one wife, and it seems a logical way to interpret where she's living, no matter what kind of instruction she's at.
What I meant was Hinduism is very Catholic in its sort of monastic relationship, but Krishna has a relationship with the gopis.
Yes.
And very many of them, and that is never questioned, and it's not considered irreverent. But still the longing is represented in each individual gopi.
Yes, and I'm suggesting the same thing is true within a monastery.
I'm very familiar with that. I mean,
yeah.
It's not something that is considered, there's something wrong with it, or he's not considered a polygamist or anything like that. There is an individual longing of the woman for Krishna. And like I said, it's a monastic sort of religion. As far as I know, Hinduism is. As a matter of fact, it's been called Catholic, in that Holy Mother called it Catholic at one point. So I just, if it's not familiar to Europeans, I would say that even in India, it would be very familiar as far as what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Oh, Sue, this is so fascinating. And I may be incredibly dense, but I need help understanding why the polygamous Jesus is so familiar to African American Catholics.
Well, I was shocked, I must tell you. The first time I read it, in fact, I read a much larger paper, I was amazed by the reception. They were delighted. But they were delighted because a great deal has happened within African American Catholicism in the last 30 or 40 years. So this is a group of people, people you know, Sean Copeland, for example, people who have been trained very traditionally, who are beginning to understand that there is something about the way we Black Catholics worship, even at this distance from the continent. That is something diasporic that they embrace. And in fact, at the one program that gives a graduate degree in Black Catholic theology, which is at Xavier, a great deal is made to teach those people either working for a master's or working for a certificate about these kinds of things that are holdovers. And so here is an audience that is looking for the diasporic. And I mean, as you look at this text, there are so many things that talk about the Black Atlantic. It's not just the water deity. There are so many things. And this clearly, this acknowledgement of more than one wife. Look, the years, I left Carmel before final vows. And part of the way they prepare you is to talk about your marriage to Christ. Now, you're in that room with 5 other people that are going to get married on the same day. Right? But nobody talks about polygamy in that room, and nobody dares think about it, right? And I think that not only is Chikaba thinking about those women who have been professed and therefore are brides of Christ, but what made her situation different from my situation as the only Black in the convent is that I was going to be I was being formed to be a choir nun at the highest part of the hierarchy. And she would never reach that place in the hierarchy. She is, in fact, we keep calling her a nun because the nuns in La Penitencia call her a nun. But as a donada, she was not a nun. She was professed, but she was not a nun. But, those ladies in La Penitencia tried to get her canonized like crazy, and they depict her as the picture with a full veil, etc., and they have redone the history of her. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have three things. One is just trivia, which is the whole thing about Mary Magdalene being married to Jesus.
Yes.
There was a response once on a radio program where this woman was against the idea because she said, well, if Jesus is married to her, what about me?
Oh!
If he loved her, what about me? And then I think she realized in some sense what she had said, and she immediately backed up and she said, he's supposed to love everyone. You know what I mean? But it's very, and I really love the way that you contextualized the poem in the context of the convent with the Mary and Martha story and the slavery, because what this woman meant, I think, was something else. But wasn't doing the same kind of work you were talking about. Then I have a question too. What's a choir nun?
Oh, choir nuns in the United States, there were 2 groups of nuns. There were nuns who did work, they were called lay sisters. They wore a short veil. And choir nuns were educated enough to sing in Latin. And so, and they lived separate lives, so that until recently, say in Santa Clara in California, they had one lay sister who lived outside and never, ever entered the cloister, which means she lived an incredibly lonely life all of her life. But in the hierarchy, these were the nuns who could sing, who were educated enough to sing in Latin. And something else happens. The lay sisters do not sing the divine office because they can't sing in Latin. And so they have a formula. On Sunday they say 12 Our Fathers and 13 Hail Marys, and the rule tells them what to do. And it is assumed that they are probably illiterate. Certainly they're illiterate in Latin.
Thank you. And then a historiographical question. You were talking about the way that it might be possible in looking at the Vita to separate out her voice because of dialectical or language features. So my question is how surely can that be done, or can that be done? But I'm more interested in what does it say about her? I mean, you gave us a couple of really terrific examples of disjuncture.
Every chapter is full of disjuncture. Every single chapter is full of disjuncture. And part of it is, how does Paniagua, well, there are two things. How does Paniagua decide she's really a saint and explain the violence? Because she is beaten. She's thrown in a pond in Retiro Park in Madrid by the majordomo of the house. I mean, the kinds of things that she suffers as a slave, as a favorite slave, as black, he has to explain. And so part of what you see is the disjuncture, and it is everywhere. There are 40-some chapters to the story, and there's not a single chapter where you don't see them in a tug of war over whose book this is.
Do you get the sense that he's starting with her account and then he's interpolating?
Exactly.
Rather than the opposite way
Rather
around?
than the opposite. We think he says she's written. We think that she has a diary or at least some sort of loose papers, and that because there are things he can't know. For example, we know not only where she's from, we know because she remembers her parents' and brothers' names, and we know that these are Ewe names. So we've done linguistic studies. We know that they're Ewe, so we can tell where she is. There is enough exactness about her life in Africa that has to be hers. Paniagua is not writing that on his own. You can tell where he is because he has her living in a court, a royal court like Spain, and then it's pulled back. And so we're really quite adamant in our translation about trying to show her voice here. And then there are places. We think she must have been taken to southern Spain before she gets to the Marquis de Montera's house, because that is a northern dialect. And he has places where he has quotes. They don't use quote marks. They use a kind of italics. And it is in the dialect of southern Spain. The poem is in that with a little changes. So that I don't know how reliable, but I think that the text taken as a whole, it's a rather large text, can show that she must have had a hand in it. And for me, that is really, really an important statement about how she, after all, crafts her life, given what has happened to her, being taken at the age of 9. She lives, quite a long time. And so I think that she's quite wonderful in the ways in which she claims her agency.
I really, really appreciated the way you problematized the category of hagiography and the social construction of sainthood and that sort of thing. I found that when you moved to this particular text and talked about it as a cross or a hybrid of slave narrative as well, I am unfamiliar with that genre, and I was wondering if you might problematize that genre for us as well, or say something more about it. So that was one question. And then the other one is related to what you were just speaking about, her hand in the text, but also, here's the question, her hand in the process for sainthood. I think you mentioned that this was like 1757 or something like this text that begins the beatification of her.
And she's still not beatified.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting to know. But
we think she will be. It's a big push for black saints now.
But was she still alive at that time?
Oh, no.
She had died.
She died.
But she was obviously living while it was being written, and then, okay.
That's right. So she lives while it's written. They compile it. It's published. We found, about 6 months ago, a play about her. The only extant copy we know is in the Schomburg in New York. Yes. It is about 30 years after this, and it's an epic play in poetry. So, people are really working on it, and then it falls into some kind of disuse. But if you, there are bunches of things. If you Google her, you will find that for years she has been a patron for Black Sisters Conference here in the United States. And the facts about her life are all wrong. But somebody, Ivan and Sertima, wrote a paragraph about her in a book about African women in the West. And the Black Sisters Conference took her up and have this same picture on their website. And I just got an email from a striptease artist who had looked up Teresa Chikaba and has named herself Chikaba. And she has this wonderful website where she's disrobing, but she has embraced Chikaba. She's an incredible woman. I love her. But yes, she has that hand in it. Now, for the slave narratives, a part of what I did by shorthand here is to gesture at what a slave narrative does. And part of it is about escape, and escape through knowledge. And it is a looking back. And this text follows the trajectory that we have identified as the trajectory of slave narratives. Now, there were plenty of slave narratives that weren't true. There were plenty of false ones. But this is a very interesting one. And one of the things that I don't do in this paper, I do elsewhere, is that I look at spiritual narratives by people like Jarena Lee, and I compare the language in those slave narratives and incidents in those slave narratives with Teresa Chikaba. And what I find is that even before there is a formula for what one would do in a spiritual narrative, Teresa Chikaba does some of the similar things. So, for example, she says, they let me enter the convent, and a couple of sisters met me. But they did not know what I saw, because on either side of the choir, on either side of the chapel, were all of these people that I now know were nuns who had lived in that convent for hundreds of years. And I said my vows in the hands of Saint Dominic. She said, so he was there. Cloistered nuns don't say their vows usually in the hands of a man, and they say them literally in the hands. So, you put your hand, the prioress puts her hands like this, and you put your hands on top of them. She says, I said mine in the hands of St. Dominic. And when years later I described who was there, they said, yeah, those were the nuns who used to live here. Then you look at Jarena Lee, who talks about when she is commissioned by Christ to preach when her own church would not let her preach. And you can put these notions of getting a private license to be in the life you're living. You can read them next to those spiritual narratives. They're fascinating in their parallels. Oh.
I had 4 observations,
Okay.
and I'll ask them one at a time. Okay. First, Martín de Porres.
Pardon me?
Martín de Porres.
Oh, yes, yes.
It looks to me like Chikaba and Martín de Porres have a certain kind of preference within Catholic culture for sainthood. Mm-hmm. African or black, submissive, high exemplars of unquestioning Christianity, humble, and taking the subordinate status well, so to speak, without protest or challenge. Is there a stereotypical pattern in the selection of black or African saints in these 2 characters, Chikaba and Martín de Porres?
Yeah. In fact, there's a section I left out about Martín. Of course, Martín de Porres is illiterate, and one of the ways in which you make sainthood and you're African is, in fact, there's a great deal of talk about this poor illiterate saint who comes to know God, and that Chikaba, he says that Chikaba is literate, makes her very different. I think that the stories we have, and I don't have a chance really to give all of them, but she is not always that docile. So that, especially toward the end of the story, she is telling choir nuns, you need to help me in that kitchen if so-and-so is going to get professed today. So she's not quite as acquiescent as Martín de Porres. But I think within Catholicism that the standard way of depicting African saints is to talk about them as humble, and to praise them for the ways in which they acquiesce. And so I'd say, yes, there is a certain amount of that, especially with Martin de Porres. But in the midst of that, you could see me thinking, what do you do with the saints of Uganda who are members of the royal court? It's not about acquiescence in their canonization. But we think that with the African church growing as it is, and with the church trying, in fact, to speak to a larger constituency that's much more active in Europe, that we're going to find more African saints canonized in the next few years. It is a political, after all, process.
The second issue was your characterization of her as a black female subject in Spain of the time. Mm-hmm. Is she really a residual African in identity, or is she really an acculturated Spaniard? Especially since, if Maria Frias is right, mm-hmm. who is also an alleged biographer of Chicaba, yeah. she puts her as someone who is learned the household of her masters before, and to a large extent reflects that once she is donated to the convent. So I wonder if she became more Spaniard than the Spanish in the context.
Well, I don't know. And Maria Frias and I know each other. We've given papers on Chicaba together in Salamanca, and I saw her when she was here. I read Chicaba as, in fact, being, as you've heard me, as knowing how to play the system in some very interesting ways. I think that, in fact, as you look at the miracles, and one of the things that you do is you read the larger text, and as you look at the ways in which Teresa Chicaba does healing in the text that resembles certain kinds of African medicine, so that there are residual aspects of African culture clear through the text. And my notion is that when Maria Frias looks more closely at those holdovers, you might talk about syncretism, but I would never talk about her as more Spaniard than the Spanish. Though, in fact, the one thing that I don't talk about often that I think is important, at the end of this text, when she dies, Paniagua says that she was so holy that she turned white. And a good medievalist would not laugh at this, since all dark saints, as a sign of their holiness, turn white in the Middle Ages, and some turn white when they're baptized. And so part of it is the way in which one talks about whiteness as holiness. And so clearly there's a residual aspect of Paniagua's notion of how whiteness is superior and what that does in the text. And so part of the reason that Balthazar and I are very interested in separating out what Chicaba talks about and what Paniagua talks about is, in fact, in response to the kinds of things Maria Frias says. Because if, in fact, she has a separate voice, as we say, and you can discern it, as we believe, then, in fact, you can't make that sort of overall assumption about the ways in which she's been co-opted.
And finally, my two observations mm-hmm. about the language and two terms that you use. Mm-hmm. Donada and la negrita. Mm-hmm. Now, donada, as we normally would understand it in English, is someone who is donated, mm-hmm. so to speak, not so to speak, not only a gift, but to a great extent. If you look into early 20th century donadas in a place like Panama and Costa Rica, that's where the orphans who had no other place to go were donated to the convent, so that the convent became the orphanage, and they became essentially not only the household servants, for all practical purposes, no different than an indentured or enslaved person, although many were, upon adulthood in places like Costa Rica and Panama where I've seen this, were allowed to leave after 21. But before 21, they were essentially servant, no different than a common slave. For example, in Panama, you would see all the laces that the West Indians did in the convent, Carmelite convents, by the way.
I know.
All right. And they proudly display that in the Museo de las Carmelistas, the Museum of the Carmelites. And I look at that and says esclavitud, slavery.
Slavery.
Is that true in the word that a donada essentially is being given to be not only in the lowest rank, but to be no different than an absolute indenture.
There were almost no donadas in Spain. In fact, when she looks for a monastery, there's a huge section in here that talks about the Monteras not having the power to make a monastery take her, even with their money. And so there's this wonderful one in Avila which says something like, a choir sister says, a black woman in my monastery in my time, never. And so she's turned down at almost every single monastery. And so one of the things as we look at the papers from the Monteras is that they couldn't really palm her off as a gift. And they had to free her. So there are manumission papers on file. And I suppose if she did not want to remain inside, and oh, by the way, she also enters after 21. She enters at the age of 23 with manumission papers, with her papers for freedom. And so we ask ourselves, as the paper says, so why would she enter? Except that there were very few freed black women who did not live really very, very difficult lives. She may have very well decided to enter because it was better than the choice of working in mines, which is what black women did in a good deal of Spain. They were laundresses sometimes in very large laundries, etc. So she may have chosen it as the least of evils, and it's true that she works hard in that monastery. She's also called a beata, as it's used interchangeably. And so we know, as you heard me say, donata is a gift, and we know about the ambiguity of her position there. Maybe a slave.
Well, let's go down perhaps to the final evidence and we'll talk about that. And that's the term la negrita. Now, you follow that term in contemporary Dominican Republic, for example. And that's a term not of diminution like negrito or smaller land or the little black if you translate it in English, okay? It's literally a term of lesser or inferior. Is that the case when now or then you still refer to her as la negrita?
Well, one of the things that you're doing is that you're doing a comparison between the New World or Spanish America and Madrid. I don't know. Certainly, it's not how people use the term in Salamanca now for Chicaba, who is really a person of great fame, and who, for that monastery, as I say, you talk about donada and slavery. I have this feeling about why La Penitencia continues to exist. It exists off of the funds that come from pilgrimages to her. And so there is a way in which they are still living off of her dowry, and I make no bones about that. That and a few cookies they sell. So that I would never ever suggest that she was the freest agent in that house. I think that poem says it. I think that poem calls into question what her position at the lowest part of whatever you want to call the hierarchy within the Dominican house in which she lived. At the same time, there is some ambiguity about her status as slave, given the document and the ways in which the monastery embraced her toward the end of her life, if that's what you want to call about it. When the monastery is moved, it's moved when Napoleon and the Napoleonic forces come to Spain, and they are routed from their monastery. They take but one possession with them. They take the body of Chicaba.
I had a few comments. One's really simple, and it's why do you think her confessors, her actual confessors, not this priest that came in the last minute of her life, what do you think were the politics surrounding the fact that they didn't write her life story, since they were the kind of collaborators in her spirituality in some ways? And the other thing is about the genre of hagiography. I have a really interesting parallel in the life story of a woman who was born in India, sold as a slave, and came to New Spain in 1620. And it's really quite interesting when you talk about, the creativity and the ability of a person to play the system. I look at the priest himself as a writer and think about the problem that he has, because hagiography requires this life narrative with the graces that the child received during childhood. So then childhood itself in this foreign place becomes a real problem. And the priest that I looked at, who wrote this Caterina de San Juan's biography, he relies upon travel literature to sort of corroborate her story. And he does the same kind of thing. He says that she's from a noble family. She's from the Mughal kingdom of Akbar, and so on and so forth. And thereby creating more problems for himself because, this is Islamic heritage that he's bringing into New Spain. So there's a lot of different ways that I see that, the priest himself has the text and the woman, and the text is very rich and you're trying to get back to it, but then the priest himself is doing some very creative work himself. And the last thing I was going to say is part of the creative work that my priest had to do was to explain her virginity, because she's a slave. She came over on a boat. She's constantly fighting off pirates. All of her miracles at the beginning of the story are about protecting her chastity. And I was wondering if you ran into the same kinds of things.
No, because she comes so young. So she's young. She sounds younger than the saint you're talking about.
Same age,
9 years old? There's none of that in here. But of course, she's been taken by the nobleman, the Spanish nobleman, whom we later find out is Archangel Raphael. But so there's none of that. That's interesting. There's nothing about protecting her chastity. In fact, he takes great pains in talking about how she has not reached puberty and that she is just about ready to go into seclusion when she, for initiation, when she is captured for the slave ship. So that's one of the ways that he talks about it. And then he talks about her unusual piety when she gets to Spain, that she is immediately pious, and that her notion is that she had met Christians, or she'd met the Blessed Virgin before she got to Spain, whatever that story means. She tells a story of the possibility of return to Africa, Sankofa, in part of it, and how she chooses not to return, but that the Blessed Virgin gave her a way to return, etc. And you had a first question.
You don't think he looked at travel literature at all to sort of describe what Africa was like and so on?
Yes, we have. And the other thing, he hasn't. But one of the things about Paniagua is that he evidently was a professional hagiography writer. So he has, one of the ways that we can look linguistically is he's got a bunch of hagiographies he's written. Most of them are by Teatines. And so this, about Teatines, about people in his own order. But he's got stuff that he's already published. And so part of what we've done is looked at Paniagua's works over and against this one. And this is it's a different work.
Yeah. You mentioned, Sue, somewhere towards the beginning middle of your talk about the inextricability of gender and race here. And at first I was kind of collecting some of your stories and examples, and I thought, well, but they're all kind of lined up by her femininity. So the story of her vision of the Virgin Mary, and the story of her converting the Turkish girl. But then, if I understood you correctly, I mean that you were saying that it's through those moments that race is somehow treated inadvertently in some kind of way. That's a statement. And
yeah. Oh, excuse me.
For example, she claims to have been baptized already beforehand in her vision, and then it seems that she's, from the story that you're telling about the Turkish girl, it seems that she's can approach the Turkish girl in a different way because she's not an intimidating, dangerous
man, but that there's also an element perhaps there of she's not as far on the other side of the racial or national hierarchy as those other people are from the Turkish Girl. So I was wondering, again, talking about, I forget his name, Paniagua? Paniagua.
Bread and water.
That helps. It helps hear it on this side of the room. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how what the usefulness, or how he might have seen this and how it would have been useful or not, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're implying about.
How he would have seen both her blackness and her femaleness,
and in writing her biography, using gender as perhaps a less fraught category, I don't know, or maybe more, to talk about that, or is that not indeed what's going on?
That's interesting. It probably is a less fraught category because there are, after all of these hagiographies by men about women that precedes this, and they're really nothing other than a few about Africans, after all. I should tell you that I, as a person in African American studies and in women and gender studies, feel that gender and race are always in intersection with each other, as is class, etc. And so my readings will always try to do both at the same time. Now, what Paniagua's doing with this, I don't know. But I think that she is both female and black, and there is something she has in common. I should first tell you that maybe this is how to do it. The first part of the story about the Turkish woman, Paniagua describes the beautiful Turkish girl, and he talks about her complexion, and he talks about her looks. And he compares her to the ugly, black, African Chicaba. I mean, it's there in the text. It is just atrocious. And so race and gender and the inability to be black and beautiful is embedded in this text, in this whole story of the Turkish girl. So there is race and gender as it can not be separated. And yet, the ugly black woman has this power of conversion because she has grace and she can argue for the church in a way that other men, unmarked men, if you know that category, white men, in other words, cannot.
And that again seems like him talking about race
I think so.
Through gender. In other words, beautiful seems a more significant category when he's talking, right? If he's talking about a woman that he wants to.
Well, I suggest to you that they're always together. That the issue of beauty and blackness, for anyone who's lived here for a long time, knows how inextricably connected those questions of whether black is and can be beautiful. And so I would suggest to you that you try to understand. Try to understand what a theorist like Kimberly Crenshaw says, that they are always, that gender and race are always together. Now, the difference, the difficulty with it seems to me, as one talks about it in the other work that I've done, is that it is difficult to talk about them at the same time. So that, in fact, what you have to do is to talk about them serially. So you talk about race and move into gender, or you talk about gender and move into race. But to talk about them together, because of the ways that they are discursively connected, it's almost impossible to do, if that helps. No?
I think we have time for maybe one more comment, or maybe two, as we near the end of the hour.
Thanks. I have a question, and it has to do with your attempts here to card out the understory, Chicaba's story, out of this hagiography, and trying to find out what the limits are of that. Is there any sense you get from her work of what her personal aspirations were? Does she express regret? Does she express anger? Her attitude about children? Reflections on her own history? Anything about how far can you get in terms of identifying her own voice, and where can't you get any further?
Well, in fact, she doesn't talk about the kinds of desires or that one might typically talk about with women. She does talk about an instance where she might have married and her decision not to marry. She does talk about going home. She does talk about what it would mean to go home, what it would mean, and the news she's gotten of home, and who is no longer living. So does one have a home to return to? She's given, she claims, the opportunity to return by the Marquis and the Marchioness. And when she finds that no one is living whom she remembers, she leaves she decides not to return. So you hear a bit of that, but not that kind of deep personal life. You hear something about playing as a child, what it meant to play. What she tried to do is she carved out some time for herself. So there are these little vignettes, but not the kinds of things that you're talking about. Somebody asked me, and I have been looking for it, where is there desire in this text? And I think it's a very, very important question. And part of it is in the manipulation of the notion of convent as harem, not only in the polygamous Jesus, but in, and so I've written a paper in which I look at the convent as harem, in which she has more mobility than the choir nuns inside, because she can go out, and she talks about going out in her life outside the walls and coming back in.
I really appreciated and really enjoyed also your talk, and particularly the parts where you take apart the language and the different voices within the text. And I did not know about this figure here in history at all. So I'm kind of excited to kind of learn about it. But I've been looking at slave narratives of different versions and different kinds. In particular, most recently, Sojourner Truth, and I'm keep making these parallels in my mind and connections to to the text of the narrative, but also the scholarship that has sort of like worked with the in between the taking apart the textual elements, and so much of it is about questions of whose voice it is and who's writing this, and for what purpose. It is totally political, which initially does not appear that way. It's very interesting. When I first encountered Sojourner Truth's text, for example, I kind of felt, well, it was sort of flat. I couldn't penetrate it. It was just really, I thought, it's going to take me a long time. So I've become very interested in autobiography, particularly in sort of non-dominant dominant communities as resistance. And I hear so much from you about how this text and her writing and her existence in that community at that time in Spain was very much about how to survive, and how and where can we resist. And it's so interesting that that this spiritual community becomes a kind of haven, but yeah, but with a lot of questions. And, anyway, I just wanted to comment on my appreciation here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to thank everyone again for your wonderful comments and the interchange with our speaker, and to thank Sue Houchins once again for this very, very stimulating talk. Thank you.
Thank you.